morning, everyone. How are you doing this weekend? We had a brief break from the heat, and it has been delightful. And then there's been so many things going on this week. The terrible fires, just, it's like Groundhog Day. It hadn't gotten any better. 2020 just keeps on coming and says, you're going to remember this year. This week in our lectionary passage, which the lectionary is a group of readings that basically take us through the story of the Bible throughout the year. And this week, the passage is talking about forgiveness. Peter, one of the disciples of Jesus, goes to Jesus and he says, if someone in our church, in our community, remember everything was based around the temple and the community. And he says, if someone sins against me, how many times should I forgive them? And Jesus says 70 times 7, which that number is kind of an odd number, but it meant in that time and day, that number 7 meant wholeness, completeness. So essentially what he's saying is infinity. You forgive them. You just forgive them. And forgiveness back then meant a restoration to the community. Remember, I've talked before about the fact that their society was not individualized like us. Like, if you hurt me or I hurt you, then I forgive you or you forgive me. And it's about the individuals. But what would happen if someone accumulated debt, or if they were dishonorable towards someone, or they committed some sort of sin, that forgiveness meant that they would have their place restored back into the community, because they would have been expelled from the community for whatever sin that they had committed. So what Jesus is always calling his disciples back to, and what these words continue to call us back to, is this time of creation, of restoration. And remember that the scriptures start with the beginning, the creation, when everything was as it should be. So this notion that forgiveness pulls us back to this moment of goodness, of wholeness. Now, by the very nature of creation, we're talking about something new. So forgiveness is not talking about going back to the way things used to be. Forgiveness is talking about going back to a position where new life can go forward and a new path can be made forward. And that's kind of a different way of thinking about forgiveness in some instances. Sometimes if you have an argument with someone, or someone does something to hurt you, and then they say they're sorry and you forgive them, then the notion is, well, things will just go back to the way they were before. But how many times does that really happen? You can't go back to the way anything was before, because everybody's different now. But if we think of it in terms of a restoration to creation, then what happens is there's this restoration, a renewal, so that we can go forward together with something new and more life-giving. And most of you know that anytime that you've had a long-term relationship and you've gone through difficult times and you've hurt each other and you've forgiven each other, then that in some way strengthens the relationship so that it grows into something stronger. Now, this notion of forgiveness that Jesus is talking about is not something that happens happenstance. It's a very intentional spiritual practice, actually, in that your forgiveness does not depend on what the other person does. Just like God's forgiveness is not a transaction. It doesn't depend on us doing something. And that might be different than you've heard or than you think. But this idea of grace is an unmerited favor. It's a mercy given to us as a gift. And we're called, out of gratitude for that gift, to give the same gift to others. There is this great book called Don't Forgive Too Soon. And it talks about what things were like in the first century Mediterranean, and what Jesus' words when he says, if someone hits you, turn the other cheek. And if someone takes your cloak, then turn around and give them your tunic. And if someone asks you to carry their load for a mile, then carry it 2 miles. And when we first read that, that just sounds so, so mamsy-pamsy passive, like we have to take everything. And that's not what Jesus is saying at all. And this whole forgiveness thing is not saying that people should stay in abusive relationships or that you should not speak up at injustice. No, forgiveness is something very different than that. In this first century Mediterranean, if someone were to slap a person, and they only use their right hand to do these things, and so they would slap you with the backhand, and that would be showing dishonor to someone. And so if you turned your cheek, then the only way that they could slap you again would be to use the front palm of their hand. And that, strangely enough, that was an honorable way of slapping. So in that instance, you are giving the invitation for that other person to stop slapping you if they don't want to slap you as an equal or in an honorable fashion, but you're also maintaining your own dignity. And forgiveness is never about giving up our own dignity. It's about creating space so that the negative words or actions of another don't ever diminish your own integrity or your own dignity. And then the thing about the cloak and the tunic, well, the tunic was kind of like your underwear. And so if somebody took your cloak and then you gave them your tunic, well, you'd be standing there naked, as we say in Lubbock, Texas. But in that culture, it was not dishonorable to be naked, but it was dishonorable to look at someone who was naked. So in that instance, again, you are offering them this opportunity to stop what they're doing and regain their integrity, their dignity, but you're maintaining your own. And then finally, if somebody forces you to carry, sometimes the Roman soldiers would force the slaves or the ones that were being oppressed to carry their load. But it was written that they could only get them to carry them for so long, let's say a mile. So if you were forced to carry something for a mile, then if you went and carried it further, that showed a weakness on the oppressor. So do you see how that works? Is that if you practice this maintaining of your own dignity and you give them the opportunity to do the right thing, and if they don't, then shame on them. It takes practice, this idea of true forgiveness. And it's not about diminishing your own self-worth, but it's about providing a way forward for everybody. And this is something that in the life of faith that Jesus was trying to tell his disciples. You've got to be prepared for resistance. You've got to be prepared that people are going to treat you badly, because what we have to offer is going to disrupt the status quo. And Matthew, the gospel writer, was trying to condition this community, this fledgling community of followers of Christ, that things are going to be difficult, but you can't be disheartened and you can't develop this root of unforgiveness and bitterness. You have to maintain a spirit of forgiveness, a spirit of life, a spirit of mercy, because otherwise it diminishes the whole thing. I'm reading this fascinating book on it's by John Meacham. His Truth is Marching On, and it's about John Lewis. I would recommend it to anyone. I mean, it is just such a powerful story about John Lewis and all of those freedom fighters and the people that stood up for injustice and still do today. And one of the fascinating things that I learned was that they would go to these schools, to these camps, to learn the practice of nonviolence protest. And it actually, in practice, is a way of maintaining your dignity and practicing ongoing forgiveness. They would go to these camps and they would do role playing and stuff about this is what people are going to say to you, this is what people are going to throw at you, and so that they would be so conditioned then when they made those marches and they would be beaten and cursed at and things would be thrown at them, that they could keep on going, keep their peace about them, and not resort to the violence that was being given them. And all of this was based on the truth of the gospel of Christ, that he met violence with love, that he never met violence with violence, that he understood that the only way to defeat hate was with love. And John Lewis, that was in his heart his whole life. They mentioned Pete Seeger. You may have heard of him. He wrote a lot of folk songs back in the 50s and 60s and 70s. So I watched this documentary about him called Pete Seeger, The Power of Song. And he got crossways with the powers that be. He used his voice and his songs as a form of protest and as a form of proclaiming a better way forward that would bring justice and equality for all. And it was met with quite resistance. And during the era of McCarthyism, there was a lot of paranoia and they would investigate people, and Pete Seeger was actually banned from the radio, from playing his songs on the radio or him appearing on TV for something like 17 years. But it didn't diminish his heart or his spirit. He just kept singing where he could sing. And then when those 17 years were up, and there was a TV show called The Smothers Brothers, and they wanted him to come sing. And so they finally worked it out where he could come, and he played his songs, but there wasn't any of this resentment or hate. It was just still in the power of love. So that's the kind of forgiveness I'm thinking about today, is that as we move forward, there's so much hatred and division in our country, and whether it's soon or whether it's 4 more years, we're going to need to practice forgiveness in order to heal from all of these divisions. And so I invite you this week to think about this intentional practice of how do we maintain the center of self that centers around the kind of love that Christ showed us, and have an attitude of gratitude for the forgiveness that we've been given, and extend that to one another as we carve a new way forward into a new creation. God bless you, and go in peace.